The flag-draped coffin of Private Samuel Miller rested under the solemn Virginia sun, a silent testament to a life cut brutally short. At the podium, a four-star general spoke in resounding tones about courage, about valor, about the ultimate sacrifice. He told the gathered crowd of grieving family members and stoic soldiers how Private Miller, without hesitation, had thrown himself upon a live grenade to save the lives of his brothers in arms. The words painted a perfect picture of a hero, a selfless warrior who had earned the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor, which now lay on a velvet cushion beside his portrait. Everyone called him a hero. His tearful mother clutched the folded flag to her chest, finding a sliver of comfort in the narrative of her son's bravery. His father stood tall, his face a mask of pride and unbearable pain. But across the manicured lawn of Arlington National Cemetery, the four surviving members of his squad stood apart. They were the men he had saved. They should have been the living proof of his heroism, yet there was no relief in their eyes. There was only a deep, haunting guilt. As the general's voice boomed, a sacrifice made not for glory, but for love of his brothers, the squad leader, Sergeant Elias Vance, flinched, as if struck. His gaze fell to the ground, his jaw tight, his knuckles white. The narrator's voice begins here, a quiet whisper against the backdrop of official praise. Everyone called him a hero. They said he sacrificed himself for his brothers in arms. But the men he saved, they knew the truth. They knew that the real reason Private Miller jumped on that grenade was not to save them, but to save himself from a secret he could no longer carry. This is not the story of a simple hero. This is a story of why he chose to die. The story of Private Samuel Sam Miller's journey to that fateful day began 6 months earlier, in the dust and heat of a forward operating base in Afghanistan. He was not the archetypal soldier. Where others were loud, he was quiet. Where they were built of thick muscle and swagger, he was lean and wiry, with the thoughtful, distant eyes of a librarian rather than a grunt. He was an easy target for the casual mockery that serves as a bonding ritual in the military. His squad, a tight-knit unit in the 101st Airborne, was a cross-section of American youth forged into a single, lethal entity. At its head was Sergeant Vance, a man who seemed carved from granite, his leadership style a mix of tough love and unyielding standards. The squad's hotshot was Corporal Diaz, a cocky but brilliant marksman from East LA who saw Miller's quiet nature as a weakness. Then there were the others. Doc Henderson, the unflappable medic and preacher, a gentle giant from Tennessee who read his Bible every night. Into this hardened family, Sam Miller was the awkward outsider. He struggled to keep up on the punishing ruck marshes, his mind often drifting during weapons maintenance. Sergeant Vance rode him hard, believing he was breaking the boy down to build a soldier. In this line of work, Miller, hesitation gets you and everyone around you killed. Vance would bark during training exercises. Your head is in the clouds. Get in the damn fight. Diaz was more direct. You're gonna be a liability. Bookworm. He'd sneer. Hope you can read your way out of a firefight. Sam never responded to the taunts. He simply absorbed them, his silence mistaken for weakness. But he wasn't weak. He was observant. He saw the flicker of fear in Diaz's eyes after a near miss with an IED. He saw the exhaustion behind Sergeant Vance's iron facade. He saw the humanity they all tried so hard to bury beneath layers of bravado. He just didn't know how to be a part of it. He felt like a ghost, present but not truly there, a silent observer in a world of noise and violence. The mission that would change everything, the mission that would plant the seed of Sam's destruction, came a month later. It was codenamed Operation Silent Viper. The squad was tasked with infiltrating a small, heavily fortified village, nestled deep in a Taliban-controlled valley. Their objective was to set up a covert observation post and confirm the presence of a high-value target, a notorious bomb maker known as the Engineer. It was a high-stakes, high-risk assignment. They were to observe only, no engagement unless absolutely necessary. They moved under the cloak of a moonless night, ghosts in the rugged landscape. They found the perfect spot, an abandoned two-story building on the edge of the village that offered a clear line of sight to their target's suspected compound. For 2 days, they watched, rotating shifts, speaking only in whispers, living on protein bars and stale water. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the cramped, dusty rooms. On the third night it happened, Sam was on watch with Diaz. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets. Sam, fighting off a wave of exhaustion, shifted his position. It was a small, simple movement, but it was enough. His canteen, not properly secured to his webbing, slipped and clattered against the stone floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. Both he and Diaz froze, their blood turning to ice. Below their window, a lone figure, an enemy sentry on patrol, stopped dead. His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the darkened building. He unslung his AK-47, his suspicion clearly aroused. Sergeant Diaz whispered into his radio, his voice tight with panic. "We've got a problem, sentry's onto us." Sergeant Vance's voice came back, cold and clipped. "Does he see you're negative? But he's not moving. He knows something's up here." The squad was faced with an impossible choice. If the sentry raised the alarm, the entire village would descend upon them. They would be trapped, outnumbered, and annihilated. Their mission and their lives would be over. Vance made a decision. It was a brutal, pragmatic calculation born from years of impossible choices. "Diaz," he whispered, his voice laced with a grim finality. "Take him quietly. Make it disappear." Diaz understood. He drew the combat knife from his sheath, his face pale in the faint starlight. He looked at Sam, his eyes burning with a mixture of blame and fear. "Your fault, bookworm," he mouthed silently. Diaz moved like a phantom, slipping out of a back entrance and melting into the shadows. Sam could only watch, his heart hammering against his ribs, his body paralyzed by a new kind of fear. This was not the abstract fear of a firefight. This was the intimate, horrifying prelude to a calculated killing. He heard a muffled scuffle, a choked gasp, and then silence. A terrible, profound silence. Diaz reappeared a few moments later, his face ashen, a dark stain on his sleeve. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to Sergeant Vance. The threat was neutralized. The secret was safe. But it wasn't. Just as the squad began to breathe again, a light flickered on in the window of a house directly across from them. In the window, framed for a single, heart-stopping second, was the face of a child, a little girl, no older than 8, her eyes wide with a terror that would be burned into Sam's memory for the rest of his short life. She had seen it. She had seen what Diaz had done in the shadows. She stared at that building for a moment that stretched into an eternity, then vanished back into the darkness of her room. The squad extracted before dawn, the mission a success in the eyes of their commanders. They had confirmed the target's location, and a drone strike would handle the rest. They were ghosts who had left no trace. But they were wrong. They had left something behind. They had left a piece of their humanity in that dark alley, and they had taken a new, terrible secret with them. The aftermath of that night was a cancer in the soul of the squad. On the surface, nothing had changed. They returned to the routine of patrols and chow hall banter, but the unspoken secret was always there, a silent fifth member in every room. Diaz became more aggressive, his jokes louder, his swagger more pronounced, a desperate attempt to outrun the memory of the man he had killed. Sergeant Vance became even more withdrawn, his orders clipped, his eyes holding a new, weary depth. But the weight of the secret fell heaviest on Sam Miller. He was the one who had dropped the canteen. In his mind, a direct line connected his clumsy mistake to the death of that man and the terror in that little girl's eyes. He was no longer just an awkward outsider. He was a catalyst for darkness. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole his breath and haunted his sleep. He grew quieter, thinner, his eyes sinking deeper into his skull. Vance tried to address it once, pulling the squad together. "What happened back then? It doesn't leave this circle," he said, his voice low and hard. "It was him or us. We did what we had to do to survive. We bury it." Everyone nodded, but the words were hollow. You can't bury a memory that is still breathing. Sam wanted to speak, to confess his role, to scream until the guilt stopped eating him alive. But he couldn't. How could he explain that he felt responsible, that he believed he was a curse upon the men he served with? His performance in the field deteriorated. He became hesitant, jumpy. During one patrol, he froze for a split second under fire, a moment of indecision that almost cost Preacher his life. The incident cemented his reputation as a liability. The whispers followed him everywhere. He was broken. He was going to get someone killed. And in the dark, lonely confines of his own mind, Sam started to agree with them. He believed he was a danger. He believed his presence was a stain on the honor of the men around him. The guilt had festered, metastasizing into a profound sense of worthlessness. He was a soldier who had enabled a killing and traumatized a child. What good was a man like that? The ambush came 2 weeks later. It was a classic, perfectly executed trap. The squad was clearing a series of buildings in a known enemy stronghold when the world exploded. They were funneled into a small, enclosed courtyard, and insurgents opened up from the rooftops on all 3 sides. They were pinned down, trapped in a kill box. Bullets chewed at the crumbling walls around them, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Doc Henderson was hit in the leg, screaming as he tried to apply a tourniquet to his own wound. Diaz lay down, suppressing fire, his face a mask of furious concentration. Vance was on the radio, calling for air support, his voice calm despite the hellstorm erupting around them. They were holding on by a thread, and then the thread snapped. A grenade, thrown from a rooftop, sailed through the air in a lazy arc and landed with a soft thud in the exact center of the courtyard. It lay there for a second, a small, green harbinger of death, no more than 10 feet from any of them. Time seemed to warp, slowing down to a crawl. Everyone saw it. Everyone froze, their minds struggling to process the inevitable. 4 seconds. That was all they had. 4 seconds until they were all torn apart. In that moment of suspended time, Sam Miller looked up. He saw the faces of the men around him, illuminated in the chaotic flashes of gunfire. He saw Sergeant Vance, the hard man who had tried to make him a soldier. He saw Diaz, the bully who was now fighting desperately to save them all. He saw Doc, bleeding in the dirt. And beyond them, in his mind's eye, he saw another face, the face of the little girl in the window, her eyes wide with terror. And in that instant he saw his path. It was not a choice born of courage or valor in the way the world would later describe it. It was a choice born of an unbearable, crushing weight. It was a choice born of a desperate need for redemption. He believed his life was already forfeit, a debt owed for the life that was taken in that dark alley. This, he thought, was how he could finally pay it. This was how he could make it right. This was how he could stop being a liability and, for one final, fleeting moment, become a salvation. He didn't shout a warning, he didn't scream a battle cry. He just moved. With a surge of desperate energy, he pushed himself to his feet and lunged forward, covering the 10 feet in 2 powerful strides. He dove his body curling into a protective ball and landed directly on top of the grenade. He looked up one last time, his eyes locking with Sergeant Vance's. In that final, silent exchange, Vance understood everything. He saw the guilt, the pain, and the terrible, beautiful release in Sam's eyes. The world dissolved into a deafening roar and a flash of white-hot light. When the ringing in their ears subsided, the surviving members of the squad looked at the spot where Sam Miller had been. They were alive. They were covered in dust and blood, but they were alive. The grenade's blast had been almost entirely absorbed by Sam's body. The ambush was broken moments later by the arrival of air support, but the real battle for the survivors was just beginning. They were saved, but they were also damned. They now had to carry the weight of 2 secrets: the ghost of the man in the alley, and the ghost of the boy who had died to silence his own demons. We are back at Arlington. The ceremony is over. The crowd has dispersed, leaving only the 4 soldiers standing before the flag-draped coffin. Sergeant Vance steps forward. He looks at Sam's parents, his face a canvas of unspoken grief. He knows he can never tell them the whole truth. It would be a cruelty beyond measure, but he can give them a piece of it. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," he says, his voice thick with emotion. "Your son, Sam, he didn't just save our lives that day. In many ways, he saved our souls. He was a better man than he ever knew. He was a better man than any of us. He was my brother." He chokes on the last word, unable to continue, and a single tear finally traces a path through the dust on his cheek. Later they stand before his simple white headstone. No one speaks, there is nothing left to say. They share the silence, the burden, the memory of the quiet boy who taught them the most terrible lesson of war. That sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are not born from a love of life, but from a desperate need to escape it. And sometimes the price of survival is a secret that must be carried to the grave.